June 1944. Over the white chalk of England's southern coast, the air smelled of oil and salt, and a war that had been going on for years. A routine fighter sweep, one more circuit flown in a season of circuits, carved a thin shadow across the cloud-sliced sky. The Spitfire had done its job for months: climb, fight, return. Its pilot was practiced in 1,000 small decisions that together kept men alive. Then the Merlin coughed. The noise was not catastrophic at first, just a roughness, a stutter in the engine note that pilots trained to treat as a warning. Instruments flickered. A thin, bitter smell began to come through the cockpit vents. Burnt oil, electrical ozone, the metallic tang of something failing. The pilot reached for controls out of habit, fingers working the familiar knobs, checking altimeter, fuel gauges, oil pressure. He was steadied by training. Scan, identify, strip actions into smaller tasks. In war, that method kept motion from becoming panic. The pilot is recorded in contemporary documents as Flight Lieutenant Indefinito. His name appears in sources variously as Allman, Orman, or Alman. That uncertainty follows him into the story, a small, bureaucratic whisper that underlines how quickly details fray in the press of history. What is certain is the sequence. The Merlin stumbled, the cockpit filled with smoke and oil spray, and the pilot chose to leave his machine. He trimmed the aircraft, jettisoned the canopy, and stepped into a thinner world. The canopy came off like a skin tearing free. The wind hit him full, cold, loud, and astonishingly clean. In the chaos there was a strange interval of clarity. The parachute blossomed, a white silk flower against the sky. Down below, the landscape turned, and the Spitfire, wings level, nose slightly down, control surfaces oddly neutral, did not go with him. If you love deep historical mysteries, stay with this one to the end. He watched his machine take on an independent life. From directly beneath him in that slumped, dangling view, it looked impossible. The cockpit, once his domain, now a hollow shell. The harness hanging, the oxygen hose spinning like some abandoned tether. The instrument panel a small dark rectangle behind a windscreen modeled by prop wash. The rising fear was not that the plane would crash right away. The pilot expected that, but that it would not behave as anything he recognized. For a few minutes, the Spitfire maintained flight. From the ground, the scene was stranger still. Men at an RAF field, recorded only generically in the paperwork as a nearby airfield, possibly indefinito when cross-referenced against inconsistent place names and surviving notes, saw a single-engine fighter come in low, its profile familiar but its cockpit empty. It executed a shallow circuit, a measured turn for landing, and then catched down beyond the prepared threshold with a hard grinding thud. It rolled, eventually stopped. The ground crew advanced with a kind of stunned slowness.
There are images that insist on themselves in this story. The canopy ripped away, the empty seat, the flutter of a chute on the grass, a helmet abandoned. People remember a ticking propeller. When the engine seized and the propeller continued to wind down, it made a mechanical tick, an almost human metronome counting out normality. And they remember the odd hush that followed. Men who had heard the roar of Spitfires all summer described suddenly a silence that felt deliberate, like a held breath. What to call that silence? The local gossip in mess halls would later call the incident uncanny, a little like a ghost story told between bites of stew. The official files did not. Engineers looked at oil lines and bearings, they checked logs, they tapped the metal, read the stains. The tension between what people saw and what the inspection proved would become the heart of the tale. The flight itself unfolded with those close, cinematic beats a storyteller dreams of. Imagine the inside of the cockpit, the smell of leather and warmth of instruments, the small, persistent vibration of the prop. The pilot had flown this aircraft on routine patrols above southern England for weeks. He knew where every panel was, could set the trim with a fingertip, could find the throttles in the dark by touch alone. That habit is not charm, it is survival. He felt the first symptoms like anyone would, a note in the engine that didn't fit the scale. He glanced at the oil pressure gauge, it dipped. He felt the drag of an engine seizing and smelled the metallic, bitter sign that oil under pressure was no longer doing its work. In that confined space of metal and glass, there is an economy of gesture. The pilot eased the aircraft into its best glide, set the trim to keep the nose level, looked at the sky, then at the needle of the gauge that kept falling. He throttled back, more out of procedure than expectation. He tested the system as if to confirm that something had in fact gone wrong. Smoke thickened. The canopy was jettisoned. A panel banged against air, and with a jerk he left the cockpit. The parachute took him, inflating with a decisive snap that always announces itself in stories and reports alike, something complete and irreversible. Then the odd visual. The empty cockpit reflected the sun in a way that made it seem like some dark, inverted face. Observers later described the harness as set, the control stick centered, trim set to a position that matched a cruising attitude. The aircraft was not careening wildly. It was traveling as if someone very skilled had deliberately set it to behave. On the ground, different eyes witnessed the approach. Men who polished boots and wrenched spanners in hangars looked up and saw a Spitfire come low into the circuit. The field remained functional, its routines uninterrupted by miracle or failure.
The plane made a shallow approach, a low, almost hesitant arc, and then made contact with the grass beyond the runway proper, a heavy thump that jolted the ground crew and drew people out like birds from a roost. They walked toward it in small groups, lined up with the curving shadow, and where others might have screamed or run, there was a more disciplined stillness, men who had learned to look the dangerous straight in the eye and then name it. When they reached the aircraft, the first thing they saw was what the pilot had already seen from the air: no one in the cockpit. There were no signs of a struggle, no torn harness straps, no blood. The parachute lay crumpled nearby. A helmet had rolled some distance away. The oxygen hose hung out of the side like a suggestion of attachment. Mechanically, the controls were in place. The trim wheel sat where it had been left. The landing gear, contrary to what some might expect, had been down. How had that happened? The official report would later suggest a combination of residual hydraulic pressure and the aerodynamic forces of a slowing, grounded circuit. Investigators arrived. They were not dramatic men, they were meticulous. Engineers took the plane apart where necessary, reading it like a book of events. One after another they documented the damage and the traces of failure. Oil pressure had been lost, the engine had seized. A rupture or failure in the lubrication system allowed metal-on-metal friction to build until the Merlin stopped producing power. Some published summaries of the incident point to a failure mode consistent with what the pilot had observed: oil starving the engine, followed by ignition of burnt oil and a smoke-filled cockpit. What the engineering party emphasized was chain of causation thinking. A failure rarely stands alone. The trim had been set by the pilot to hold the aircraft in a stable descent, an action that, in isolation, would set the machine to fly a predictable arc. The weight distribution on that particular day, the state of the tanks, nearly empty on return, and even a favorable heading combined to make the plane behave like a carefully balanced glider. The hydraulics, even when the engine had ceased delivering, could still hold pressure for a time. In an airplane like the Spitfire, small residual forces and the exact settings left by an experienced pilot can, in rare cases, lead to a stable, if short-lived, flight. But official explanations do not extinguish the image. They do not remove the sense of uncanny presence, the idea of an aircraft, instrument panels cold and unreadable, and yet somehow aligned with a path home. Men told the story differently in mess halls than the engineers wrote it up in their neat reports. In conversation, the language would tilt toward haunting. It came back without him, one might say, and the word "it" would stand in for all manner of discomfort about machines acting autonomously. Engineers would laugh ruefully and point to valves, to the trim wheel, to oil pressures. Both were telling different parts of the same truth. The investigation that followed was thorough by the standards of wartime practicality. That practicality is a theme of the story. War rewards expedience. A machine that can be flown again is valuable. A puzzle that can be reduced to maintenance protocols is less dangerous if it can be explained. Engineers examined oil lines and seals. They measured the wear on bearings and pistons. They consulted logbooks. Fuel records revealed tanks nearly empty, consistent with a return leg when fuel burn has already removed the margin for error. The logbook entries and maintenance notes were cataloged. From those inspections, the investigators derived a parsimonious narrative. Lubrication failure led to engine seizure. The pilot, facing smoke and imminent fire, evacuated. The aircraft, trimmed for a stable descent with controls centered and with vacuous tanks, continued to arc toward the airfield. Hydraulic residuals and aerodynamic loading allowed the gear to deploy or stay extended. The plane touched down hard but intact. The ground crew found an empty cockpit. It was a rare convergence of mechanical circumstances, but it was not, in the engineer's assessment, miraculous. That account is crucial to remember, because the human mind prefers stories with agency. We like to give purpose to things. An unmanned aircraft returning to its base looks intentional at a glance. Intent fixes the image into a shape we understand. Someone coming home, a will that survives its body. But machines do not choose. Machines obey physics. Where people see design, engineers see cause and effect. And yet the story resistantly kept its shadow.
Soldiers and mechanics who saw the thing coming and touching down would later speak of a chill that had nothing to do with cold air. They used words like eerie and uncanny, and occasionally the more dramatic haunted to capture the sensation. Those words were not scientific, they were social. The incident did not remain in private talk forever. The RAF logged it. The event moved into official records with the sober language of assessment: oil loss, engine seizure, crew survival, aircraft recovered. The entry was a pragmatic nod, valuable data in a time when value and loss were counted daily. The next entries in the paperwork show that the aircraft was not returned to frontline service. It was reassigned to training duties, used for instructional flights and non-combat tasks, until the wear and history of its components put it beyond effective reuse, at which point it was scrapped. That bureaucratic afterlife is important. It demonstrates a wartime logic that is uninterested in romance. The Spitfire that returned empty to the ground did not become a shrine. It became a set of parts. Even so, the image of the pilotless Spitfire did not die with the aircraft.
Stories circulated, each retelling a reframing, each retelling a test of memory. Some accounts, seeking to explain the oddness, pointed to similar documented cases in other theaters where aircraft glided to ground after a pilot had left. Others compared it to rare instances where pilots were forced to bail out, and the machine settled into an acceptable descent because it had been carefully trimmed. Those parallels offered a kind of comfort. Once you see examples, the improbable feels less supernatural. Technically, the episode raised questions that engineers and designers would continue to address. Aircraft stability and redundancy are not merely academic. Trim tends to set an aircraft's natural attitude. In the Spitfire, small adjustments matter. Designers and maintenance crews learned from every anomaly. Hydraulic systems were always a point of interest. What happens when pressure bleeds down? Can gear remain extended by aerodynamic means alone? Answers in physics are not metaphors, they are pragmatic. More broadly, the event exposes a persistent human unease with autonomy. We are trained to be masters of our tools. When a tool appears to exercise behavior without human input, it challenges that assumption. That unease is part of the reason the story stuck. In wartime, where machines and men had become deeply enmeshed, a small rupture in that relation became a folk motif. The Spitfire, sleek, valiant, emblematic, returning without its pilot, created a psychological gap that documentation could not entirely close. Consider, too, the way memory and paperwork diverge. In the mess hall, a man might say, "I saw it come in with no one at the sticks," and the narrative takes on human color. He remembers the wind, the way the sun flashed on the canopy, the propeller's tick. In the logbook, teethers and bolts get recorded: date, time, engine number. Both records exist in parallel. The official report is not false, it is simply different in texture. It seeks to explain and to neutralize risk. Oral memory seeks to capture the feel of a night, when the ordinary rules inclined toward the uncanny. Another thread through this story is the wartime habit of burying anomalies under the usefulness of machinery. If a wing is fixable, fix it. If a plane can serve in training, put it there. Exceptional events do not always change doctrine overnight. They produce amendments and adjustments. Checklists get longer, filter maintenance gets more rigorous, inspections perhaps a touch more frequent. But the cultural retelling, what people carry home to their families, often reshapes the incident into a story that responds to human anxieties about death, control, and the mechanical world's encroaching autonomy. From a structural standpoint, incidents like this play design questions in stark relief. The Spitfire was famously responsive, a delight and a challenge to fly. Responsiveness means that small inputs can produce large outputs.
Trim, which seems a humble wheel on the panel, can, when left in certain positions, set the airplane's attitude for a whole descent. If the pilot trims to compensate for a failing engine, he is setting, in effect, a blueprint for how the machine will behave if left to its own devices. That fact is the hinge on which the rational explanation swings. The pilot's last acts, combined with an engine that could not generate thrust, meant the airframe conserved the state the pilot desired. Engineers who inspected that Spitfire found evidence, oil streaks, scorched metal, consistent with a lubrication failure. They did not find signs of sabotage or tampering. The evidence had a prosaic cleanliness that suited their discipline. A leaking oil line, a clogged filter, or a failed seal can all produce similar outcomes: a sudden and cataclysmic loss of oil pressure. Once the pressure drops, bearings overheat, pistons stop moving smoothly, the engine seizes. In the enclosed space of a cockpit, oil spray becomes smoke. Smoke implies fire risk. Under such conditions, training instructs the pilot to leave. There are, of course, variables that the engineers could not quantify precisely in their reports because the surviving documents are not exhaustive. Certain numbers, exact altitudes at bailout, precise trimming degrees, are indefinitive. The transcript of contemporary notes contains inconsistencies in spellings and place names. We are left to reconstruct a narrative that is both faithful to the forensic record and respectful of the gaps. Those gaps are not failures. They are part of how history is made. They preserve room for both explanation and awe. One theme that runs through the witness accounts is the priority of life over property. In the immediate moment, men on the ground did not stand around marveling. They ran to help the pilot, who was alive and shaken. The aircraft, though important, was replaceable. That practical ethic explains part of the official posture: recover, recover, and return to service what can be returned. War is full of ways in which the extraordinary collapses into the ordinary of work, yet collapsing it does not erase the memory of what people felt. Comparative cases across other air forces show similar mechanics at play. There are documented instances, archival and anecdotal, where fighters or bombers continued in controlled manners after pilots evacuated. The phenomenon is not endemic to one design or nation. It is a mechanical possibility, given the right alignment of controls, weight, and attitude. That pattern does not diminish the oddity of a single, visible aircraft returning empty to a field full of human witnesses. It simply reframes it within a broader pattern of physically explainable events. How did cultural retelling shape the incident over the years? Speech, as it travels, rounds corners. Men told their families and friends about the Spitfire that came back without him.
The story moved into memoirs and into local legends. In each retelling, details shifted. Helmet farther away, canopy more mangled, engine tick more insistent. Memory elongates certain images and discards others. The fact that the pilot survived and lived to tell of his parachute and landing made the incident more potent. Survivors are the best narrators of their own luck. It is worth stepping, briefly, into the psychology of seeing. When human perception is trained to find patterns and causes, it sometimes imputes agency where none exists. An airplane neatly aligned with a runway line, approaching its home base, looks like it is coming home on purpose. That is a powerful image because it assigns to the object the single humanized act of returning. Machines do not home, they follow gradients of force. Yet the image persists because it satisfies the mind's preference for persons rather than processes. There is also a moral dimension to the story. Pilots embody a certain social trust. They take risks that enable others. They act with skill under pressure. When a pilot walks away and his machine follows an arc that surprises the witnesses, the community experiences a small moral shock. Men who had trusted the pilot's decisions now have the sensation of that trust reflected in an inanimate thing that nevertheless seems to have followed his intent. In an odd way, the aircraft's continued motion felt like a confirmation of the pilot's competence, even if it was a mechanical echo rather than a conscious act. Wartime bureaucracy took note. The RAF's official records treated the event as data. It was useful, a reminder that oil systems matter, that trim settings can have large consequences, that maintenance schedules must be precise. The aircraft's reassignment to training and eventual scrapping showed the logic of conservation and utilitarianism. There is a certain melancholy to that administrative arc. Something that once pulled men into combat now pulled new trainees into the same lessons, and later was reduced to parts. Yet despite the paperwork, the cultural memory did not accept the incident simply as a maintenance note. Stories held the image that mattered most: the empty cockpit, the spinning prop, the quiet on the field. That image feeds a deeper fear, older than aviation, about what happens when our tools begin to operate without us. In a 20th century world becoming ever more mechanized and automated, an unmanned aircraft returning home tapped into anxieties about agency and control. So is the incident a ghost story? In one sense, yes, if by ghost we mean an image that resists a tidy reduction and persists in the imagination. Witnesses used the language of haunting to capture the feeling. But to claim the event as a supernatural occurrence is to step outside the evidence. An engineering explanation exists that fits the facts without invoking spirits.
The truth sits between these poles, the mechanical causes and the human response. That tension between explanation and feeling is the real mystery. It is what makes the story terrifying in a psychological sense. Terror, in this context, is not about violent spectacle. It is the slow, undeniable sense that normal rules of human control over tools can be suspended without warning. In the thick and busy year of 1944, that suspension was not really academic. It touched on survival and mortality. A pilot jumps and lives. His plane returns alone. That inversion is unsettling. There is a final, quiet lesson in the aftermath. Machines are made and maintained by people. They fail and they continue. They sometimes imitate intention when intention is absent. The pilots and the engineers who encountered this event adjusted their practices and carried with them, in memory and in logbooks, the raw fact of its possibility. The Spitfire itself was eventually broken up, its panels recycled into other things. The pilot went on with his life. The men in the hangar returned to their tasks. Paperwork was filed. A note was made in the ledger. But the story continued to live in ways the ledger could not entirely capture. It became one of those wartime tales that human beings repeat because it reassures and unsettles at once. It shows how a single anomaly can reveal larger truths about the limits of control, about the interplay of human decision and mechanical law, about the ways in which a moment can be both explained and remain strange. We can imagine one of the men who saw the landing walking years later through a quieter airfield, stopping beneath a clear sky, and thinking of that day when a plane came back without its pilot. He might still hear, in his memory, the propeller's last ticking. He might still see, as if pressed into the air itself, the image of the empty cockpit. We all carry such images, small, unsettling talismans that remind us how fragile the appearance of order can be. In the end, the terrifying aura of the story is not a statement about ghosts. It is a statement about human feeling when confronted with an event that interrupts habit and expectation. The engineers closed the case of the report about oil, trim, and hydraulics. The men who saw it kept the moment alive in speech. Both accounts are true in their modes. The plane's return was explainable. The feeling it produced, of something uncanny arriving at the edge of habit, was equally real. If you want to explore more mysteries like this, stories where machines, men, and the fog of war intersect, subscribe and keep watching. There are more of these quiet, uncanny incidents threaded through history, moments when the physical world misaligns with expectation, and memory does the rest. June 1944 remains fixed in the paperwork and fluid in the telling. Flight Lieutenant Indefinito. Ullman, Orman, or Alman bend the event into his life and his papers.
The Spitfire, once a tool of war, became a footnote in a log and a lasting image in people's minds. The terrifying mystery of an aircraft that came home without its pilot is not a refutation of rationality. It is an encounter with the limits of what we predict, and a reminder that sometimes explanations and impressions will live side by side. For those who saw it, the plane's return was more than a mechanical coincidence. It was an experience that redrew the border between human intent and mechanical response. For the engineers, it was a case study, a problem to be solved. Both responses, emotional and technical, are part of the same history. The truth, then, is less a single answer than a layered one, a mechanical sequence that is true, and a human reaction that remains unassuaged. We are left with the image the title promises. Terrifying, yes, but terrifying because it reveals how fragile our sense of command can be. The Spitfire did not come back as an agent. It came back as the consequence of small forces aligned in such a way that the machine performed a last, anonymous act of homecoming. That is both less romantic and more unsettling than any ghost. It tells us that sometimes the world behaves in ways that look like intention, and yet are only the play of forces, filters, and chance. In that seam lies the story's power. So the mystery is unveiled but not silenced. It becomes a lesson in humility, about technology, about memory, about how war flattens certain things into practicality, while leaving others to linger in the dark corners of recollection. The Spitfire that landed with no pilot aboard did not change the course of history. It changed a few people's perception of control, and for that reason, it remains a story worth telling.